It was a cold morning at the Lakefield County Courthouse. I adjusted my simple black suit, pushing open the heavy door, a door I'd always walk through as an assistant district attorney, not a defendant. Across the room, my father and Vanessa, his wife, were a portrait of expensive malice. Her low hiss cut through the air. "She thinks she's a star from that one time she dared to sing in my house." The memory of the slap at 19 years old hit me harder than the cold air. The air in the Lakefield County Courthouse was a clean, biting chill. It smelled of ancient coffee, polished cherry wood, and the thin metallic scent of fluorescent light. My name is Ariel Shepard, and I adjusted the simple, functional lines of my black suit. It was the same standard uniform I wore every day, a uniform meant to convey authority, precision, and neutrality, but today, it felt like a cheap costume. I pushed through the heavy double doors of Courtroom 3B. The wood was solid, stained dark by decades of legal drama, and the sound of my sensible low heels on the linoleum floor was sharp. Click, click, click. That sound usually belonged to a conqueror, a prosecutor on her way to dismantle a defense. Today, it was the rhythm of a target walking into the crosshairs. This was my territory. I had spent 3 years carving out a reputation in this very building, working for the Aurora Heights District Attorney's Office. I knew the angle of the light at 10 o'clock in the morning, the faint squeak in the third chair on the left of the jury box, the subtle, weary sigh of the air conditioning unit, but I was not standing at the prosecution's table, the familiar, powerful spot, with the thick leather blotter and the clear view of the witness stand. I was crossing the gap, walking toward the smaller, more exposed table on the defense side, the table reserved for the accused, the scrutinized, the defendant. My eyes locked onto the plaintiffs. There they were, Greg Cole, my biological father, sitting rigidly, hands clasped, the perfect picture of an aggrieved man. He was wearing an expensive tailored suit, the kind of suit my grandfather, Walter Rhodes, had ultimately paid for over and over again. Beside him, like a blinding, poorly cast star, was Vanessa Cole, my stepmother. Vanessa was performance art in human form. Today's ensemble was a pale lavender sheath dress, a color chosen, I suspected, for its perceived innocence. Her jewelry was distracting, a diamond necklace that caught every sliver of the overhead light, heavy platinum on her wrists. Everything about her screamed victim, if you ignored the predatory gleam in her eyes and the razor sharpness of her posture. They were huddled with their lawyer, Damian Holt. Holt was a shark in a $3,000 suit, famous for his aggressively emotional defense of corporate criminals and his equally vicious pursuit of family assets. As I walked closer, they stopped their murmuring. Vanessa saw me. The smile never left her face, but her eyes narrowed, hard and cold. She leaned into Holt, her perfectly manicured hand touching his arm, and then she let the words drift, loud enough for me to hear them clearly over the low, anticipatory buzz of the room. "Look, Damien, she thinks she's a star from that one time she dared to sing in my house." The casual cruelty was instant, precise, and meant to wound. The air in the room seemed to thin. It wasn't just a dig at my singing, or even the small amateur clip of me performing that had surfaced recently. It was a perfectly weighted grenade, tossing the memory of the abuse right back into my lap, here, in the cold, professional light of the courtroom. I felt the heat rise behind my ears. It had happened when I was 19 years old, a college freshman, officially a legal adult. I had returned to Hawthorne City, invited by Vanessa to try and live as a real family. I'd brought my cheap guitar, hoping the music could bridge the void. I'd sung a song my real, deceased mother had sung to me on old cassette tapes. Vanessa hadn't just objected. She had launched herself across the dinner table, screaming, "No one wants to hear that voice in my house!" And then, smack, the sound of her palm on my cheek had echoed through the big, silent house. My father had watched it happen. He hadn't lifted a finger to stop her. The emotional memory was a physical nausea. Control. You are a prosecutor. Control. I reached the defense table. My chair scraped against the wood, a sound too loud. I sat down, keeping my face a careful, neutral mask. I was not the scared college kid who had packed a suitcase and fled into the cold Hawthorne night after being struck for the crime of having a voice. I was the person who prosecuted people like them for fraud. I was the person who was now going to turn their history of emotional and financial abuse into a legal counter-narrative. A sudden, deeper silence fell over the room. The clerk of the court, a stern, older woman named Mrs. Jennings, called for order. Then, the rear door opened with quiet gravity. Judge Miriam Blake entered. Judge Blake was a legend, a woman of sharp intellect and zero tolerance for theatrics. Everyone in the room rose as one. The judge moved to the bench, her black robe flowing, and took her seat. Her eyes, keen and direct, swept across the courtroom. They paused on the plaintiff's table. Greg, Vanessa, Holt, then they moved to the defense table, to me. Her hand, which had been reaching for the gavel, froze midair. "Be seated," she instructed, her voice deep and steady, but she didn't look away from me. Mrs. Jennings began the standard recital. The matter of Cole versus Shepard. Petition for contest of will and distribution of estate. Judge Blake interrupted, leaning slightly forward, her gaze piercing the room. "Assistant District Attorney Shepard?" she asked, a noticeable edge of surprise in her tone. "It is passing strange to see you at the defense table. I trust you are here only in an advisory capacity?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. The meticulously controlled buzz of the courtroom broke into 100 whispers. "The defendant is Ariel Shepard? The DA's office? She just won the Reynolds case, the one with the $600,000 corporate fraud. The advantage, the total, crushing certainty that Greg and Vanessa believed they held, was instantaneously shattered. They had anticipated a timid, overwhelmed relative, perhaps an inexperienced lawyer. They had not prepared for the courtroom's reigning champion, albeit one on the wrong side of the railing, to be their opponent. Vanessa's lavender-clad shoulders tensed. She shot a look of pure venom at Damien Holt. A silent interrogation. "Why didn't you prepare me for this?" Holt, maintaining his composure, rose, smooth as glass. "Your Honor, as co-counsel for the plaintiffs, I can confirm that the defendant is Ms. Ariel Shepard. However, her professional title, while perhaps relevant to character, does not change the facts of this case, which is a clear and egregious instance of undue influence and asset manipulation." He launched immediately into the offensive. Holt's voice was warm, almost paternal, as he addressed the judge. He painted a picture of a devoted father and stepmother, Greg and Vanessa, who had been pushed out of the life of a beloved relative. Walter Rhodes. He accused me of systematically isolating my grandfather and taking advantage of the former judge's declining years and trust to seize the entirety of his substantial estate. The language was deliberately loaded. Brainwashing. Exploitation. Cold, calculating intent. Brainwashing. The word was an insult to Walter's memory. My grandfather, the retired judge who could see through a lie faster than any person I had ever known, was being described as a frail, incompetent puppet. I sat still, absorbing every word. My training took over. Listen, watch, analyze the opponent's narrative structure. Holt's strategy was clear. Make the case about my ambition, my perceived lack of filial piety, and my cold professional demeanor. He wanted the court to see me as the aggressive, power-hungry prosecutor, using my skills to steal from my own family. My inner voice, the one I had cultivated and toughened over years in law school and the DA's office, was sharp and insistent. This is not just about the money. This is not about the estate. This is about them trying, one final time, to silence the voice they couldn't stand. The case was a proxy war. The millions of dollars in my grandfather's will were merely the ammunition. The real battle was over whose truth would be heard. Would it be the polished, theatrical performance of the parents who abandoned me, who only showed up when the money ran low? Or would it be the truth I carried inside, the The 22 years of abandonment, the kindness of my grandparents, and the single, brutal slap that defined the day I finally left them for good? The prosecution seeks to invalidate the final will, Your Honor, Holt concluded, his voice ringing with false righteousness, and return the legacy of Justice Rhodes to the rightful, dedicated, present heirs, his daughter and his son-in-law. It was a magnificent lie. They had been present only for the money. Walter Rhodes and my grandmother, Eleanor, had been the only truly present people in my entire life. Judge Blake turned her attention to me, her expression unreadable. "Miss Shepherd," she said, her voice formal, "do you have counsel representing you in this matter?" This was the moment, the final piece of the initial shock. This was the moment I got to use the sharp tools I had forged in this very room to cut the ground right out from under their feet. I stood, my back straight, my gaze meeting Judge Blake's. I spoke slowly, my voice clear and utterly devoid of emotion, the voice of a prosecutor presenting an unassailable case. "Your Honor, I am represented by attorney Noah Mercer." I paused, letting the name, a well-known, formidable estate litigator, settle. Then, I delivered the final blow, my voice gaining just the slightest degree of steel, aimed not at the judge, but across the room at the smug faces of Greg and Vanessa Cole. "And, Your Honor, may the court note for the record, it was in this very courtroom, using this very seat, that I successfully prosecuted 3 separate defendants for financial fraud cases, the total amount of which was significantly larger than the paltry sum they are attempting to extort from me today." A wave of audible astonishment swept through the room. Vanessa's lavender dress seemed to deflate slightly. My father's rigid posture finally broke, his fingers clenching the fabric of his expensive trousers. I sat back down. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my exterior remained perfectly composed. The battle had officially begun. The person they intended to crush was a seasoned veteran, armed with the law and a history they hoped would remain buried. I knew the rules of this arena better than they did, and I was ready to use every single piece of that history, including the slap and the singing, to prove that they, and not I, were the fraudsters. The heavy, authoritative thud of Judge Blake's gavel brought me back, physically, to the present. The sound, always intended to call order to the court, worked instead as a time machine. It was the ancestral sound of law, and it instantly pulled me 3 decades back, away from the stale air of courtroom 3B, toward the fresh, salty scent of Briarport. I was only a few months old that summer. My father, Greg Cole, and Vanessa, then merely his new, thrillingly sophisticated girlfriend, brought me to the quaint, weathered red brick house that belonged to Eleanor and Walter Rhodes, my maternal grandparents. Just for a couple of months, Greg had promised, quickly, vaguely, kissing my grandmother's cheek. "Until we get the new venture launched, the city apartment is too small for a baby." Eleanor Rhodes, all warmth and soft curves, had simply tightened her grip on the infant me. She didn't need to speak. Her body language spoke volumes. She smelled of cinnamon and unconditional love. Walter, my grandfather, stood slightly behind her. He was already retired from the bench, but his eyes, wise, clear, and perfectly still, were still those of a judge. They were eyes that had spent 40 years looking through lies, through rhetoric, right into the core motive. He looked at his daughter, Eleanor, then at Greg, then at me. He understood that a couple of months meant until we need something, and that in the mouth of his only child and her ambitious boyfriend, it could stretch into an infinite wordless surrender. Walter simply nodded, took the cheap baby carrier, and sealed the unspoken pact. He knew he had been chosen, not as a temporary babysitter, but as a permanent anchor. And so, I grew up in the red brick house. It was not a grand house, but it was filled with rich, profound things. Eleanor's kitchen always smelled of yeast and nutmeg, the promise of fresh-baked bread or apple pie. The scent was a constant, warm presence, a tangible proof of care. In the evenings, after the dishes were done, Walter would take me into his study, the room smelling of old leather, pipe tobacco, and ink. He never read me fairy tales. Instead, he told me stories of old cases, the tricky witness, the loophole that brought justice, the moral choice behind the law. He was sowing seeds of justice and choice in my mind, long before I even understood the concept of abandonment. My biological parents were seasonal events. Greg and Vanessa appeared only for Christmas, Thanksgiving, and the occasional birthday. They were a sudden, glamorous burst of color, expensive gifts, a bicycle I barely used, designer clothes I never wore, and loud, practiced laughter. But their eyes, even as they smiled, were distant, disconnected. They were always rushing. They'd hand over the gift, pose for a hurried photo, and then they were gone, leaving behind silence that felt much heavier than any memory they created. The absence was the fabric of my life. It was so constant, so reliable, that it didn't feel like a wound. It felt like air. I was Eleanor and Walter's girl. They were the sun and moon of my world. The first time I truly felt the separation, the absolute truth of their chosen distance, was when I was 16. I was singing. I discovered my voice late, tucked away in the anonymity of the high school choir. It wasn't a powerful voice, not a roar, but it had a certain clarity and a resonant depth that surprised everyone, including me. I was chosen for a solo at the regional performance, an old folk song about leaving home and finding a new anchor. Eleanor was there, of course. She sat in the front row, wrapped in a favorite shawl, and when I finished the last, ringing note, she was quietly crying, tears of pure, unadulterated pride tracing lines through her makeup. But 2 seats in the back row, clearly reserved and marked with the names Greg Cole and Vanessa Cole, remained empty. Just before the curtain call, I got a text message. "Proud of you. Honey." It arrived one day late. It was sterile, generic, and instantly erased the warm glow of the applause. The empty seats left a colder mark than if they hadn't bothered to reserve them at all. Then came the turning point, the single 19-year-old moment that redefined my life. I was a successful first-year college student, already on the path toward law school, already independent, but I still carried that small, foolish hope for a real family. Vanessa, perhaps feeling a societal or legal obligation, perhaps simply needing to look good for her social circle in Hawthorne City, extended an invitation. "Come live with us for a bit, Ariel, see what a real family feels like." I packed my small suitcase, my optimism heavy, and brought my cheap guitar, hoping the music could finally be the language that connected the vast, empty space between us. The house was vast, sleek and cold, all glass, chrome, and calculated silence. The dinners were tense, punctuated by the clinking of expensive silverware and the sound of Vanessa correcting Greg's grammar. One evening, exhausted by the silence, I did the one thing I knew how to do to express myself. I brought out the guitar. I played an old, slightly melancholic lullaby, the very song my birth mother had recorded on those old tapes Walter had kept for me. I sang quietly, hoping to fill the sterile air with something real, something human. I didn't get 2 minutes in. Vanessa erupted. It wasn't a complaint. It was a volcanic, uncontrolled rage. She slammed her linen napkin onto the mahogany table, making the glasses jump. "I won't have that racket in my house," she shrieked, her voice high and distorted. "No one wants to hear that voice. You're not a singer. You're just that spoiled little girl that old man Rhodes dotes on." The insult wasn't just about the volume. It was about the source of the validation. I was Walter's girl, not hers. My voice, my self-expression, was a direct challenge to her control over the narrative and, by extension, over Greg. She launched herself from her chair. It wasn't a push. It was a vicious, open-handed slap, hard and sharp, delivered straight across my face. It stung immediately, but the shock was colder than the physical pain. It was violence aimed at a legal adult, a college student, for daring to express her soul in her space. Then she grabbed my guitar. the cheap instrument I had carried all the way from Briarport, and hurled it against the polished hardwood floor. The wood cracked with a sickening sound. The message was crystal clear. Be silent. Be invisible. Be what we tell you to be. You do not get to have a voice here. And Greg? My biological father? He didn't intercede. He didn't even flinch. He just watched, then muttered a quiet, miserable betrayal. Don't provoke your mother, Ariel. Just, please, stop. That moment was the true ending. Not the slap, but the lack of action. The immediate, casual prioritization of his new wife's tyrannical control over his own daughter's physical safety and personhood. It killed the last, desperate flicker of hope I had for a real, loving family. The sting on my cheek faded, replaced by a cold, resolute fury. I pulled my damaged guitar from the floor. I was out of that house within the hour. I packed my bag and drove Walter's old sedan back toward Briarport, my heart an echoing hollow chamber. As the Hawthorne city lights faded in my rearview mirror, I made a vow to the cold glass of the windshield, a vow that has guided my entire adult life. They will never ever control my voice again. If anyone hears me, it will be because of the truth I choose to tell, not because of the permission they choose to grant. That decision, that slap, didn't break me. It was the catalyst. It was the moment I stopped hoping for a family and started building a fortress, armed with the law, driven by the belief that a voice, once violently silenced, becomes the most powerful weapon of all. Now, years later, sitting across from them in the courtroom, I knew the memory of that slap, the moment she tried to literally strike the song out of me, was the foundation of my entire defense. It proved the pattern, and the pattern was everything. The slap at 19 was the fracture, but it wasn't the end. It was the moment my life pivoted on its axis. I didn't crumble into self-pity. I channeled the immense, cold energy of that rejection directly into my work. My grades soared. I found a focus so singular it terrified my college classmates. I needed to build a life so structurally sound, so legally unimpeachable, that no one could ever use casual cruelty or financial leverage to force me into silence again. Walter was my constant co-conspirator. He was the one who reframed the violence. That wasn't personal. Ariel, he told me, rubbing the knot in my shoulder one evening. That was panic. She realized she couldn't buy you, and she sure as hell couldn't command you. That's why she went for your voice. Don't let her win that battle. Justice needs voices that don't bow down. Walter's home office was a sanctuary of dark wood, tradition, and intellectual rigor. The room was always dimly lit, shelves lined with leather-bound case histories, and the air thick with the scent of paper and history. Dominating one corner of the desk was a heavy, old-fashioned wooden gavel, the one he'd brought home the day he retired from the bench. It was a beautiful piece of carved maple, slightly worn, capable of silencing a crowd with a single, sharp rap. I spent countless hours in that room. I sat in the deep leather armchair, my textbook spread open, studying for the LSAT, while Walter worked silently on his legal memoirs. Sometimes, he'd put down his pen and launch into a complex analysis of how a courtroom was designed to weigh law against the human element, the statute versus the soul. He taught me the architecture of truth. He taught me how to read not just the words, but the gaps between them. My grandmother, Eleanor, despite her growing battles with congestive heart failure, was the emotional engine. She never complained about the trips, always insisting on driving me back to campus after breaks, always making sure I had enough homemade cookies to last 3 weeks. The memory of my college graduation is vivid, etched in soft focus and bright light. Eleanor was there. She was frail, using a cane, but she sat in the front row, wrapped in her favorite lavender shawl. When I stepped up to the podium, I had been chosen to deliver the student address. She was beaming. My speech was simple, direct, and entirely about them. I stand here today, I concluded, my voice clear and steady over the massive audience, because of 2 people who chose to love me, every single day. As I spoke, I could see Eleanor crying tears of joy and pride. Greg and Vanessa, predictably, were absent. They didn't even manage the late text this time. A massive bouquet of white lilies arrived at the student union registration desk an hour after the ceremony concluded, accompanied by a glossy card with a printed signature. It was the performance of familial obligation, entirely empty. They had mastered the art of being present only in the shallowest, most meaningless sense, reducing their relationship with me to a rote, transactional ritual. After graduation, I made a calculated choice. I applied for law school, then interned, and finally secured a position at the Aurora Heights District Attorney's Office. In Hawthorne City, the very place that had once been the stage for my humiliation, I chose to go back to the city where I was told I didn't belong, turning it into the battleground where I would fight the kind of people who abused trust and leveraged their money against the vulnerable, especially the elderly. It was a form of self-therapy, a way to transmute the injury into a professional crusade. Walter followed my career with the intensity of a co-author. He'd wait up for my calls, dissecting my opening arguments. He sent detailed emails critiquing my first legal briefs, always encouraging, always pushing. He drove 2 hours to attend my very first public trial, a small case involving a neighborhood dispute, just to sit in the gallery. After the hearing, he gripped my hand, his palm warm and familiar. "You spoke exactly the way you sing, Ariel," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Clear, steady, unwavering, and you didn't apologize to anyone." That became my hallmark. As an assistant DOA, I developed a reputation for being relentlessly prepared and unflinchingly direct. My arguments were built on rock-solid facts and delivered with a voice that brooked no resistance. I became particularly known for my severe stance against perpetrators of elder fraud and financial manipulation. I was tenacious, cold, and utterly effective when it came to defending people who had been swindled out of their savings by greedy relatives or cold callers. Few people in the DNA's office knew the real, quiet reason behind my zeal. They didn't know the personal history of 22 years of abandonment and the quiet wisdom of a retired judge who taught me that the law's sharp edge was meant to protect the defenseless. My work was an act of constant devotion to Walter, and a silent, devastating rebuttal to Greg and Vanessa. The years passed in a focused, professional blur. I was busy, successful, and surrounded by the affection of my grandparents and a few close friends like Maya. Greg and Vanessa receded further, contacting Walter only when their latest venture needed funding. Then, one crisp autumn evening, everything stopped. I was in my office in Hawthorne City, working late on the complex Reynolds corporate fraud case that would make my career. The phone rang. Eleanor, her voice thin and shaking. Walter had collapsed in his study. I drove the 45 minutes to the Briarport Hospital in a blind, terrified sprint. All the successful cases, the sharp arguments, the professional steel, it all evaporated. I was just Walter's girl, speeding toward a possible end. I didn't make it in time. I walked into his sterile hospital room, and the silence hit me first. The familiar, deep intelligence in his eyes was gone. He was still. The funeral was quiet and dignified, held in the small, old church in Briarport. The entire town came out for their beloved former judge. Eleanor was a ghost of herself, frail and impossibly sad, but maintaining her quiet dignity. She held my hand tightly throughout the service. After the last eulogy, she leaned close to me, her whisper surprisingly firm against the overwhelming quiet of the church. "He prepared for this, Ariel, every detail. He knew. All you need to do is trust what he arranged." I looked over at Greg and Vanessa, sitting in a pew 3 rows back, looking uncomfortable and conspicuously overdressed. They looked less like mourners and more like investors waiting for the quarterly report. Walter's passing left an immense, gaping void, but as Eleanor suggested, it was also the opening of a door. The day after the funeral, I went back to the red brick house and walked into the quiet darkness of his study. The room smelled the same: leather, paper, and wisdom. Everything was exactly as he had left it. On his massive, heavy desk, next to the worn maple gavel, was an old, dark wooden box. It was a simple antique piece, unadorned except for a small, faintly carved R on the lid. That box, quiet and unassuming, was the physical gateway to 22 years of financial secrets. It contained the meticulously documented truth that was about to blow the lid off Greg and Vanessa's carefully constructed narrative of the devoted, scorned family. Walter hadn't just died. He had prepared the final, crushing exhibit for the case he knew was coming. The red brick house in Briarport felt vast and utterly silent after the funeral. A ghost of cinnamon and old leather lingered in the air. I had returned alone, filled with a sharp, dual sense of duty and dread. I felt a guilt, a profound impropriety, about immediately sorting through Walter's effects, yet I was pulled by an irresistible, forensic drive. It was as if Walter, even in death, was guiding my gaze, telling me exactly where the final pieces of his argument lay hidden. I walked into his study. The room was dark, the curtains still drawn against the weak autumn sunlight. I went straight to the heavy, wide desk where the old, dark wooden box, the one marked with the faint, carved R, sat next to his gavel. It felt weighty, dense with history and secrets, like an unexploded ordnance. I lifted the lid. Inside were not jewels or sentimental keepsakes, but 3 leather-bound notebooks. They were small, meticulously kept, and covered in Walter's precise, steady handwriting. They weren't journals. They were ledgers. I pulled out the first book. The spine was dated, spanning from the early 2000s to the year I turned 16. The entries were arranged chronologically, detailing every single wire transfer, check, and cash envelope Walter had ever passed to his daughter and son-in-law over a period of more than 20 years. I flipped through the pages, the cold shock of the evidence washing over my training. This wasn't just a record. It was a psychological map of exploitation. January 2005. The entry was chillingly detailed. Wired $2,500 to Greg Cole. Seed money for startup. No business plan provided. March 2008. Another entry. Wired $2,500 for car debt. Followed up with Vanessa. Saw an article in the society pages. Photos showed her drinking champagne on a yacht near the Cayman Islands. The entries repeated with a monotonous, relentless rhythm. The same amount, $2,500, transferred almost monthly. Sometimes more frequently, the stated reasons were constantly shifting. Unforeseen legal fees. A necessary professional expense. A sudden cash flow issue. Walter's clinical lawyerly notes often followed the entry, documenting the flimsy excuse and his own weary skepticism. I pulled out a calculator and did the cold math. $2,500 multiplied by 12 months, spanning over 22 long years. The total figure I arrived at was astounding. $660,000. That was enough to purchase a beautiful, spacious family home right here in Hawthorne City. My breath hitched. My grandfather hadn't just given them gifts. He had been their silent, endless ATM. He had subsidized the life of the daughter who abandoned him and the man who stood by while that daughter physically assaulted me for singing. They had built their entire respectable facade on a steady stream of his guilt money. Between the pages, Walter had clipped physical evidence, small, glossy photographs and newspaper clippings. I saw an image of Vanessa draped in designer wear on a pristine foreign beach. Another showed Greg, smiling, mid-swing, on a country club golf course far too exclusive for his actual career earnings. These images weren't just vacation photos, they were financial footprints. Walter's note next to a photo. Transfer requested 2 days before this trip. Claimed they couldn't afford a flight to see us for Eleanor's birthday. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. They had weaponized their absence, using distance and vague promises of a visit as a means of emotional coercion, knowing Walter would pay them to keep up appearances and, crucially, to salve his own parents' guilt. The ledgers detailed a predictable pattern. Every time their life was shown to be publicly extravagant, or every time one of Greg's business schemes inevitably collapsed. The need for Walter's quiet, monthly stipend immediately escalated. I pushed the notebooks aside and turned to his computer. The screen was dark. I typed in the obvious password, the one they would never guess, the only one that mattered, the date of his and Eleanor's wedding anniversary. The screen flickered to life. I located a folder marked G&V Requests. Inside, I found hundreds of email threads dating back 10 years. They were a devastating archive of emotional blackmail disguised as communication. Greg's emails were usually brief, straight to the point, and often laced with a hurried plea for discretion. Vanessa's were the masterpieces of manipulation. They were filled with thinly veiled accusations and tearful suggestions that Walter didn't love her as much as he loved me. "Daddy, sometimes I feel like you only really care about Ariel. What about your real struggling daughter? We're trying so hard, but it's impossible without your help. I know you're spoiling Ariel, but we need money to keep up appearances, or people will think you don't support us." They played the victim while demanding compensation for their own lack of presence. Walter, a man of profound justice, was being financially bled by the one thing he couldn't prosecute: familial guilt. The evidence deepened. I found a second, less prominent folder labeled Estate Planning. Harvey Lane. This contained dozens of draft wills and the correspondence between Walter and his private attorney. The documents clearly and unequivocally stated Walter's ultimate intention. The vast majority of his estate was to be left to me, Ariel Shepard. His rationale was written out in his own hand, appended to the final, signed document. The estate is allocated to Ariel, who was abandoned by her biological parents and who has been the only person present in my life, and Eleanor's life, when we were most in need of support. This disposition reflects duty, presence, and moral choice, not mere biology. It was Walter's final judicial opinion, written in the only court where his word was absolute. Then, tucked deep within a subfolder, I found the final piece of the puzzle. It was a digital copy of a sealed envelope, labeled in his firm script. "If things happen as I fear, this is for Ariel." It was a letter, dated 3 months before his collapse. In it, Walter warned me directly. He predicted this very lawsuit. "Greg and Vanessa will not accept the loss of this sustained financial lifeline. They view my estate not as a legacy, but as their owed, continuous compensation. They will challenge my competency, and they will challenge your character. They will do anything to regain control of the money. Be prepared. Ariel, this is their final act of leverage." I pushed back from the desk, the wooden chair scraping sharply across the floor. I looked around the room, at the heavy gavel, the meticulously kept ledgers, the hundreds of emails, the final, prophetic letter. Walter hadn't just prepared a will, he had prepared a case file. He had anticipated every single move Damien Holt and my family would make. He had spent his final years, while fighting illness, assembling the ironclad defense I now held in my hands. The idea of undue influence, the primary accusation in Greg and Vanessa's lawsuit, was exposed as a ridiculous, desperate fiction by Walter's own, painstaking documentation of their 22 years of financial dependency. The lawsuit was not an accident. It was the predictable, ugly conclusion to the life they had chosen. I closed the wooden box. The feeling of shock was replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. Walter had given me the motive, the method, and the means. He had prepared everything for this trial, down to the last $2,500 wire transfer. There was just one thing he couldn't have foreseen, one variable that would soon enter the equation and change the dynamics of the entire courtroom strategy: the unexpected phone call. The voice from the outside, the witness drawn in by a forgotten song. It was the only wild card Walter hadn't been able to document. Yet, the pressure of the upcoming trial, the chilling audacity of my own parents suing me for my grandfather's love, had been bleeding into my nights. I was sleeping for maybe 3 hours, maximum. Every legal brief I read was overshadowed by the cold calculation of the $660,000 they had extracted from Walter, and the memory of the slap that had exiled me. Maya Brooks, my college roommate and now my closest friend, a photographer with an eye for emotional truth, finally intervened. She didn't offer legal advice. She offered an escape hatch. "You're going to burn out before opening arguments. Ariel," she told me one Friday evening, dragging me by the arm, "you need to reset your soul. I'm taking you to the open mic night at the Crooked Note. You're going to sing that song, and this time, no one's going to hit you for it." The Crooked Note was a small, brick-walled bar tucked into a quiet, revitalized district of Hawthorne City. It was intimate, smelled of craft beer and old velvet, and the energy on the stage was raw and unfiltered. I resisted, hard. The thought of exposing my voice, of making myself vulnerable in that way again, felt like a breach of the fortress I had spent 10 years building. My voice was reserved for the courtroom now, for the hard, protective arguments of law, not the soft, open truth of music. But Maya was relentless. She signed me up under a fake name, handed me the old, patched-up acoustic guitar Walter had helped me repair, and gave me a firm push toward the stage. The small, elevated platform felt like a spotlight under intense interrogation. I forced myself to look out at the dimly lit faces. They were strangers, but they were kinder than the two faces that mattered most in my life. I spoke into the mic, my voice shaking slightly, the professional confidence momentarily gone. "This song," I began, the words tasting like rust, "is an old lullaby. I first learned it from a tape my birth mother recorded. The last time I sang it, I was 19 years old. It ended a family dinner, and it ended my relationship with my family. This is what I sang when I was slapped for daring to have a voice." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. I didn't wait for the pity to settle. I struck the first, familiar chord, a simple, melancholic sequence, and began to sing. The song was about a journey, leaving the land of winter, searching for the light of a new home. My voice, which was usually trained to be cold and precise, now carried the full weight of the 22 years of rejection and the fierce, constant love of Walter and Eleanor. It wasn't about perfect technique. It was about the naked truth. I sang about the empty chairs, the late phone calls, and the final, beautiful acceptance I found in my grandfather's study. As I sang, the entire bar fell silent. I could see faces blurring in the shadows, some nodding, some wiping their eyes. The pain was still in the song, but for the first time, it wasn't paralyzing, it was defiant. I sang the trauma, but I ended on a note of strength, the strength of the one who stood back up. When the last chord faded, the applause was deafening, a visceral, restorative wave of acceptance. It was a crowd saying, "Your voice is worthy, your story is valid." What I didn't know was that Maya, tucked away in a corner booth, had secretly captured the whole performance on her phone. She didn't post it immediately. She waited until the early hours of Saturday morning, when the emotional resonance was highest. Her caption was short, cryptic, and devastatingly effective. 19. She got slapped for this song. Now she is a prosecutor singing the same truth. She attached it to the video and tagged a handful of influential legal and arts podcasts. The clip didn't go viral in the usual sense. It didn't reach the millions, but it began to circulate rapidly within the exact niche that mattered. The small, highly engaged community of legal podcast listeners, social justice advocates, and crucially, the tight-knit network of high society staff, former employees, and associates connected to wealthy Hawthorne families, people who knew the codes, or knew of them. The views climbed steadily, 500, then 5,000, then 20,000. The comments weren't about my singing ability, they were about the intensity of the story, the irony of the successful prosecutor having been a victim of such petty, cruel domestic abuse. I was back in my apartment late on a Tuesday night, surrounded by Walter's impeccably organized financial records, the $660,000 pattern of exploitation. I was connecting the dots between Greg's failed amateur baseball league investment and a sudden $5,000 transfer from Walter in 2009. My phone rang. The screen showed unknown caller ID. It was late. Approaching 11:30 at night, I was exhausted, and my immediate instinct was to reject the call and get back to the files. But a strong, deep intuition stopped me. The feeling was sudden and visceral. You just put your voice out there, exposed your deepest vulnerability to the world. Someone is answering the call. I hesitated for only 3 seconds, then slid the green icon across the screen. "Hello?" I asked, my voice already back to its neutral, professional prosecutor's tone. The voice on the other end was a woman's, a smooth, low alto, slightly raspy, carrying the weariness of someone who had seen too much. "Ariel Shepard, is this her?" "Speaking. Who is this?" "My name is Lydia Hart. I saw the video. The one Maya posted. I just watched it 3 times. The song, your face, the story you told before you played. I knew that story." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Lydia, what exactly do you know?" She spoke slowly, deliberately, as if recounting a deposition. "I was a friend and, unofficially, a long-term personal assistant to Vanessa Cole for almost 15 years. I was in that house. I was there the night she hit you. I was standing in the hall, just outside the dining room, when she slapped you and threw that guitar, and I heard everything she screamed about you being Walter's spoiled girl and the racket in her house." The confirmation was like a cold stream of adrenaline. A witness to the most deeply personal, legally relevant act of violence and control in the entire history of our relationship. "Why now, Lydia?" I asked, my legal brain already sprinting. "Why are you calling me after all these years?" Lydia's voice softened slightly, a hint of something like shame or regret. "I was bound by a comprehensive NDA. Ariel, Vanessa pays well for silence, but I moved 5 states away last year, and the term of the agreement expired 6 months ago. Even so, I was prepared to let it all go, until I saw that video, seeing you, the prosecutor, the professional, standing there singing that painful truth. It reminded me of the shame I felt that night, watching your father do nothing." She then dropped the second bombshell, the one that broke the entire case wide open. "And it's not just the slap. I have something else. A recording. I was at a cocktail party years ago, a small, private gathering of Vanessa's colleagues. She was drinking and boasting, and I happened to be recording a memo on my phone for a later task. I caught her on the audio, laughing, bragging about how easy it was to bleed the old man dry. She used the phrase, milking Walter Rhodes for every $2,500 check. The evidence Walter had painstakingly collected in his ledgers, the evidence of financial exploitation, now had a voice, Vanessa's own voice. "That recording is solid evidence. Lydia, you know that, right?" I whispered, my voice thick with emotion and excitement. "I know it," she confirmed, "and I can't stand by and watch her use that money. Money Walter wanted you to have, to fund her fake victimhood. She doesn't get to call you the fraud when I have proof of what she was doing. The song brought me in. Ariel, that's the truth." We arranged a discreet meeting at a coffee shop far from the courthouse, set for the next afternoon. I hung up the phone. I sat in the darkness, surrounded by Walter's papers and the remnants of the cold, professional life I had built. I looked at the old guitar leaning against the wall. It was a profound, almost biblical irony. The voice I had been struck for, the self-expression I was told no one wanted to hear in their house, was not only heard by the world, but had, ultimately, brought the single most critical, unassailable witness straight to my defense table. Vanessa had tried to silence me with a slap and a threat. Walter had tried to arm me with law and documentation, but it was the song, the vulnerable, human truth, that had finally found the piece of evidence neither of them could have ever predicted. The game had just changed entirely. The meeting with Lydia Hart took place at an anonymous coffee shop 30 miles outside Hawthorne City. Neutral territory, quiet, and discreet. Lydia was exactly as she sounded. Weary but resolute, she passed me a small, encrypted USB drive without fanfare. "It's all on here," she said, her voice a low murmur over the clatter of the espresso machine. "The audio and the specific, written records I kept, I hated how she talked about him. I immediately extracted the audio file onto my encrypted laptop. The sound quality was poor, muffled background music and cocktail chatter, but Vanessa's voice cut through the noise, sharp and unmistakable. Click. Laughter. Honestly, Walter just transfers the $2,500 like clockwork. All I have to do is send a few emails about how much his daughter is struggling, play the victim a bit, and the money just flows. More laughter. He can't stand the thought of us not having the best. It's too easy to bleed the old man dry. The phrase, bleed the old man dry, was brutal. Hearing it spoken by the very person who now sat across from me in courtroom 3B, claiming filial love, was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. It was a clear, unambiguous admission of financial exploitation. Lydia spent the next 2 hours detailing the pattern. She described how Vanessa would routinely dictate emails to Walter, ensuring they were peppered with emotionally manipulative phrases. "I know you're prioritizing Ariel's law school over your own daughter's needs," or, "You always favored the grandchild over me." These were calculated wounds, designed to trigger Walter's parental guilt and ensure the continuation of the monthly subsidy. "She used your absence as leverage," Lydia explained. "It was a model. The more she played the victim of your success, the more money Walter would send to compensate for his perceived failure as a father." Armed with this testimony and the USB, I immediately went to see my lawyer. Noah Mercer. Noah, a calm, methodical litigator, was energized by the new evidence. "The ledgers are great evidence of the transaction." "Ariel," Noah said, spreading Walter's handwritten notebooks across the conference table. "But this audio? This is the intent. This is Vanessa admitting the fraud. This changes everything. We pivot the defense from proving you didn't manipulate Walter to proving they did." Noah and I spent the next 48 hours constructing a devastating timeline. We cross-referenced Walter's financial entries, the green file, with public records and Lydia's testimony, the purple file for witness statements. The Cole exploitation timeline. 2007. Greg's semi-pro baseball, failure. Greg's ambitious, short-lived baseball investment collapsed. Walter's monthly transfer increased from $2,000 to $2,500. 2011. Vanessa's luxury car. Vanessa purchased a new, expensive luxury sedan. The following month, Greg sent an email requesting $10,000 for emergency home repairs. Walter sent $5,000, noting, "Car purchase obvious reason, not repair." 2015. The slap and my departure. Vanessa assaulted me. In the 3 months following, Greg and Vanessa became frantic, fearing Walter would cut them off. Their requests doubled, with Vanessa using the most intense guilt language in her emails, implying I was poisoning Walter's mind. The timeline established a clear quid pro quo. The more financially desperate or personally reprehensible Greg and Vanessa's behavior became, the more aggressively they relied on Walter's guilt and money. Undue influence, in this case, flowed in the exact opposite direction of the plaintiff's claim. Next, Noah moved to dismantle the secondary claim, that Walter was somehow mentally unsound or easily swayed when he finalized his will. We contacted Harvey Lane, Walter's longtime estate attorney. Lane confirmed that Walter had revised his will 4 times over the past 8 years, always keeping the core principle intact, the substantial allocation to me, and the reduced allocation for Greg. I tried to talk him out of writing his personal reasons in the final document, Lane told Noah during the pre-trial interview, but Walter was a judge. He insisted on including his rationale, in his own handwriting, that Ariel was the one who was present and who had shown integrity. He made it clear that Ariel had no influence on the document whatsoever. She never saw a draft. He dictated the terms. Crucially, Lane revealed that Walter had proactively initiated steps to safeguard his mental competency. Noah then contacted Dr. Selena Ortiz, Walter's attending geriatric specialist. Dr. Ortiz's notes were invaluable. Walter had insisted on quarterly cognitive assessments, a rarity for someone his age. Judge Rhodes was deeply concerned about being accused of being mentally diminished by his family. Dr. Ortiz's notes read, "He stated multiple times, 'I want a paper trail to show no one can say I was confused or easily led.' He was sharp, clear-minded, and fully aware of his final wishes right up until his last collapse." The picture emerging was not of a frail old man being exploited by his granddaughter, but of a brilliant judge, well aware of his own mortality and the greed of his children, meticulously preparing his defense for a trial he wouldn't live to see. The evidence kept pouring in. We tracked down Hank Lawson, a retired fisherman who lived next door to Walter and Eleanor in Briarport for 30 years. Hank was prepared to testify. "Greg Cole?" "Yeah, I saw him," Hank recounted, his voice rough and certain. "He'd show up like clockwork at the end of the month, usually the last Friday. Always parked his fancy car right by the front door. He'd rush in, be out in 10 minutes flat with a white envelope in his hand. Never once asked how Eleanor was doing after her treatments. Just a business transaction." This corroborated Walter's ledger entries perfectly, transforming them from dry numbers into a physical, repeated act of neglect. The final, high-stakes piece of the investigation involved Greg. Knowing his desperation, I used my prosecutor's instinct. I began recording all incoming calls from his number. In one highly anxious call, Greg, clearly stressed by the impending trial and the lack of funding, let slip the true reason for his panic. "Vanessa is freaking out. Ariel, you have to talk to Noah. Tell him to settle. I told you. I owe the guys. The $500,000 I promised them. It's not a joke. These aren't friendly bank people. They're coming after me. If we lose the estate, they'll break my legs." He had been gambling. The startups and investments were thinly disguised debts to dangerous people, loan sharks or illegal bookmakers. Vanessa's hysterical pursuit of the estate wasn't about principle. It was about saving Greg's physical well-being. The entire lawsuit was an elaborate, aggressive attempt to cover a massive gambling debt using Walter's legacy. I sat back, looking at the entire body of evidence now assembled. It was massive, overwhelming. Noah and his team helped me organize it into color-coded binders for the trial. Green, financial exploitation, Walter's ledgers, Greg, Vanessa transfers, total $660,000. Red, history of abandonment and abuse, the slap incident, missing graduations, the 19-year-old exile. Purple, witness testimony, Lydia Hart's explicit account and the audio recording, Hank Lawson's testimony of neglect. Yellow, Walter's competency and intent, Dr. Ortiz's notes, Harvey Lane's confirmation, Walter's prophetic letter. Gold, the voice evidence, Maya's video of the song, the audio of Vanessa's confession. Noah looked at the comprehensive files, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face, the same smile I felt forming beneath my own prosecutor's mask. "We don't just show the numbers. Ariel," he said, tapping the gold file. "We let them hear it. We let the jury hear how they spoke about the money, hear how your grandfather spoke about his final wishes, and hear the song they tried to silence. We put their own cruel voices on trial." I finally understood the full, cyclical irony. The voice that was violently silenced at 19 was now the central axis of my legal strategy. It brought the crucial witness, revealed the deepest betrayal, and stood ready to deliver the final truthful verdict in the very courtroom where I had learned the meaning of justice. The courtroom battle was about to transform into a sound check. One morning, I opened the Hawthorne Chronicle to find my face plastered across the front page. The headline was a masterpiece of sensationalism and bias. Cold prosecutor cuts off birth mother, seizes wealthy judge's entire estate. The accompanying article was pure theater. It featured a large, glossy photograph of Vanessa, impeccably dressed but with artfully smudged eyeliner, tearfully recounting how I had allegedly banned them from visiting Dad in his final years, and how I was using my prosecutor power to intimidate my own family. Greg was photographed standing slightly behind her, wearing the meek, bewildered expression of a good father tragically caught between two warring women. The piece framed me not as the victim of decades of neglect, but as a ruthless, power-hungry lawyer who had weaponized my career against my vulnerable, loving parents. The smear campaign was immediate and effective. My office at the Aurora Heights District Attorney's received a deluge of anonymous calls and emails. They accused me of everything from psychological instability to power addiction. The campaign was designed not just to hurt my case, but to destroy my professional life. Damian Holt, Vanessa's lawyer, didn't waste a moment. Within 24 hours, he filed a motion with the court demanding that I be compelled to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, citing the public accusations and claiming I exhibited irrational hostile behavior toward the biological family unit. It was a classic ad hominem attack, designed to paint me as the crazy, ungrateful child, thus validating Walter's decision to leave me the money as a sign of his own delusion. The situation escalated to the highest level. My direct superior, District Attorney Janelle Cross, summoned me to her office. D.A. Cross was a pragmatist, known for her sharp political instincts and her intolerance for drama. Her office was quiet, the view of Hawthorne City's busy streets a distant hum. She didn't mince words. "Ariel, this is a mess," she said, folding the Chronicle with a decisive snap. "We cannot afford to have a senior prosecutor publicly accused of leveraging her position for personal gain, especially not against an elderly judge's estate. We're getting calls from the mayor's office. I need the truth, now." She looked at me, her gaze piercing. "But let me be clear. I know you. Shepard, you're our best lawyer on financial fraud. I'm not going to abandon my top prosecutor over a dirt campaign unless you're lying to me. Give me the facts I need to protect the office while you fight this." I didn't reach for the green file, the one detailing the financial transactions. I reached for the red file, the one containing the human proof. I placed the slim folder on her desk. Copies of Eleanor's diary entries detailing my parents' chronic absences, the empty seat reservation tickets from my graduation, and Walter's handwritten notes about the emotional manipulation. I told her the story of the slap, the 19-year-old exile, and the subsequent 22 years of financial exploitation. D.A. I cross-read the file in silence, her expression moving from professional skepticism to quiet, furious resolution. When she finally looked up, her eyes were hard. "They didn't think you'd fight back, did they? They thought they were dealing with a frightened kid." She leaned forward. "They don't understand the lengths I will go to protect someone who has the guts to stand up against this kind of sustained emotional and financial abuse. You focus on winning the case. Use your tools. We will handle the anonymous calls here. You are not going anywhere." The conversation was the last piece of professional armor I needed. I had the full, unequivocal support of my office. It was time to unleash the counterattack. While Vanessa was busy giving tearful interviews to a local television station, recounting the saga of her cold, manipulative daughter, Noah and I put the final phase of the strategy in motion. The core of our defense was not the documents. It was the gold file, the voice evidence. We sent the encrypted USB containing Lydia Hart's explosive audio recording, Vanessa's confession about bleeding the old man dry, to a popular, high-profile legal investigative podcast that had previously shared Maya's video of me singing. The podcast, called The Verdict is Sound, released the episode precisely 2 days before the first day of trial. The title was blunt: The ATM Grandfather, How the Plaintiff's Lawyers Tried to Silence the Truth. The episode was a sonic juxtaposition. It began with the beautiful, melancholic purity of my singing voice, detailing the raw pain of the abandonment. Then, it cut sharply to Vanessa's voice, raw and arrogant, laughing as she boasted about extracting the monthly $2,500 checks from Walter. The host then meticulously connected the dots. The song was the reason for the slap, and the slap was the clearest evidence of Vanessa's need for control and her disdain for my grandfather's genuine affection. The reaction was immediate and seismic. The public narrative, carefully constructed by Holt's media campaign, fractured instantly. The comments section of the podcast exploded. People weren't talking about whether Walter was confused. They were asking crucial, damning questions. Why would a devoted mother celebrate striking her daughter? and why would she brag about bleeding the old man dry if she genuinely loved her father? The focus shifted entirely from me, the allegedly greedy prosecutor, back to the plaintiffs, Greg and Vanessa, who now sounded exactly like the kind of financial abusers I regularly prosecuted. Damian Holt went into immediate damage control. He filed an emergency motion with Judge Blake, demanding the court issue an order to stop the circulation of the podcast and exclude the audio file from the trial, calling it prejudicial character assassination based on illegally obtained evidence. The hearing on Holt's motion took place in the same courtroom 3B where the trial would begin. Holt was aggressive, his face flushed with panicked fury. "Your Honor, this is not evidence of undue influence. This is inadmissible gossip. It is purely designed to incite the jury against my clients using inflammatory audio." I stood next to Noah, perfectly calm. Noah rose to respond. "Your Honor, Mr. Holt is correct. This is not about inciting the jury. This is about establishing the pattern of behavior. We are not asking the jury to decide based on a song. We are asking them to weigh the words of the plaintiff, the laughter, the boasting, the verbal confirmation of financial exploitation, against the written word of the deceased. A voice, whether singing or speaking on tape, is a critical component of defining intent. If the plaintiff's pattern is one of sustained financial abuse and emotional coercion, the jury has a right to hear that pattern." Judge Blake listened patiently, her expression neutral. She held up Walter's final letter, the one predicting this exact challenge. She finally looked directly at Holt, her voice delivering the final judicial blow. "Mr. Holt, this court is not in the business of censoring communication, and I certainly will not deny the jury the ability to hear evidence that goes directly to the heart of the plaintiff's motive and credibility. A person's voice, as counsel points out, is often the clearest window into their true intentions. The motion to exclude is denied." Thud. The sound of the gavel felt like a vindication for the slap, for the 19-year-old who had been told she wasn't allowed to sing. As I walked out of the courtroom, I glanced at Vanessa. Her perfect composure had crumbled. She knew that the war of narratives was over. She could no longer hide behind her expensive clothes and crocodile tears. Her own voice, captured in a moment of greedy arrogance, was now the strongest exhibit against her. I realized that the smear campaign, intended to isolate and destroy me, had instead served as a giant megaphone for the truth. They tried to silence me, but instead, they had forced my voice, and the voices of my witnesses, into the public domain. The battle was far from won, but the momentum, the moral authority, and the undeniable truth were finally on my side. The official opening day of Cole versus Shepard was not a legal hearing. It was a spectacle. Courtroom 3B was packed, every hard wooden bench filled to capacity. The overflow included not just local reporters, but an unusual number of law students and, most notably, the quiet, focused demographic, the devoted listeners of the Verdict is Sound podcast, the very people who had already heard Vanessa's damning laughter. I sat at the defense table, my simple black suit a conscious contrast to the vibrant theatricality unfolding across the room. Noah Mercer was a calm, steady presence beside me, his notepad organized into color-coded sections matching my gold, red, and green files. I kept my gaze fixed on the judge, but every nerve ending was trained on the opposite table. Damian Holt began the day with his opening statement, a performance designed to evoke maximum sentimentality. He abandoned legal jargon entirely, opting instead for a melodramatic, emotionally charged narrative. "This, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Holt began, sweeping his hand toward Vanessa, "is the story of a mother who has been tragically sidelined. This is about a family that was frozen out by a daughter who hid her ambition behind the cold, impenetrable cloak of the law." He tried to paint me as the manipulative mastermind, the hyper-professional who preyed on a kindly, aging judge. He spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the great Justice Walter Rhodes, suggesting that while his mind remained brilliant, his heart was too soft, too trusting of the granddaughter who arrived late in his life, armed with her legal expertise and her relentless, cold focus. The defendant, Ariel Shepard, may be an assistant district attorney, Holt declared, his voice rising to an indignant crescendo. But the law, in this instance, has been used as a shield for greed. She sought to manipulate her way to an inheritance worth millions, cutting off her own parents, the ones who carried the Rhodes name, and exploiting her grandfather's generous heart. The whole speech was a breathtaking exercise in projection and reversal, accusing me of the exact behaviors I knew they had engaged in for 22 years. Then came Vanessa Cole. She ascended the witness stand in a tasteful, expensive gray suit, looking subdued, dignified, and utterly wronged. She was a master of control, able to turn on the tears at precisely the right moments. She recounted her version of events, the supposed forced separation, the agony of watching her father, Walter, be stolen by his aggressive granddaughter. Ariel literally locked us out, she testified, dabbing at her eyes with a pristine handkerchief. She told my father, her own grandfather, lies about us. She used her position as a prosecutor to intimidate us, to make sure we couldn't get near him. She made it clear that she was the only heir worthy of his attention. She spoke about the Christmas presents they missed giving, the birthday visits they were prevented from making. The performance was nearly flawless, convincing the jury that she was the devoted, abandoned daughter, trying desperately to reconcile with a father who was being controlled by an ice-cold, ambitious lawyer. Next was Greg Cole. He played the role of the reluctant victim perfectly, the gentle father who simply wanted peace. He testified that he had always tried to be a good father, but I had pushed him away with my own ambitions. He insisted, with a straight face, that the monthly transfers of $2,500, the $660,000 documented in Walter's ledgers, were nothing more than unconditional gifts from a loving father to his struggling children. Walter just wanted to help us, Greg insisted. He knew we were trying to launch various ventures. It was purely his generosity. Ariel has twisted his kindness into something ugly. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. I could feel the cold fury rising, but I kept my external composure glacial. Wait for the cracks. Noah began his cross-examination by focusing on the core issue of presence. He asked Vanessa to specify the number of times she and Greg had visited Walter and Eleanor in Briarport, without an explicit request for a financial transfer in the immediate preceding or following month. Vanessa immediately floundered. "Well, Your Honor, my work is very demanding," she said, avoiding Noah's eyes and speaking directly to the jury, "and the drive to Briarport is almost 2 hours. We were incredibly busy launching Greg's new business. We sent cards. We called." "The question is simple, Mrs. Cole," Noah interjected, his voice polite but firm. "Outside of major holidays and without a corresponding request for funds, how many visits did you make to your father's home over the last 15 years? She stammered, she evaded, she talked about her intense devotion, but she never gave a number. Several members of the jury, particularly a woman in the front row who had been taking meticulous notes, exchanged a look. The first small crack had appeared in their narrative of unwavering devotion. Holt, realizing the opening argument was weakening, went on the attack. He tried to introduce Maya's viral video of me singing at the crooked note, claiming it was evidence of my deep-seated need for attention and that I was exploiting a private family tragedy to build a public image. Noah objected instantly, rising with practiced ease. "Objection. Your Honor. Relevance." "Sustained," Judge Blake ruled, her voice sharp. "Counsel, whether Miss Shepard wishes to be a rock star or not, has no bearing on Justice Rhodes's cognitive ability to write his will, or the plaintiff's pattern of 22 years of financial dependency. Move on." Holt, visibly frustrated, attempted a final, desperate Hail Mary during Greg's cross-examination. He asked Greg a rambling question intended to discredit Walter's will-drafting process, but in the confusion, Holt made a fatal error. "Mr. Cole, are you aware that your wife has a history of contesting the wills of wealthy relatives who leave large portions of their estate to non-biological heirs?" Holt asked. stumbling slightly over his own question. The defense had been preparing a surprise attack based on a prior probate case, but Holt's accidental question opened the door much earlier. Greg's face went white, utterly betraying his carefully constructed composure. I don't know what you're referring to," he mumbled. The damage was done. Noah didn't even have to object. The entire courtroom fell silent. 3 members of the jury, seeing Greg's panicked reaction, immediately started writing on their pads. The jury now knew Vanessa wasn't just grieving. She was a serial contestant of wills, with a history of challenging legacies. The accusation of greed shifted entirely back onto the plaintiffs. The first day ended in a tense equilibrium. Holt's theatrics had landed, generating sympathy for the abandoned parents, but my side had landed the crucial, surgical strikes, the unanswerable question about their physical absence, and Holt's catastrophic admission of Vanessa's 15-year history of contesting estates. I left the courthouse, the setting sun casting long, cold shadows across the pavement. The feeling wasn't one of victory, but of absolute certainty. They had made their case based on emotion and lies. Tomorrow was my day. Tomorrow, the human element of my defense, Lydia Hart, Dr. Ortiz, and the unedited voice of Walter Rhodes, would enter the record. Tomorrow, the voices they had tried to silence would speak the truth louder than any lawyer could ever argue it. Tomorrow, the voice would finally become the weapon. The atmosphere in courtroom 3B on the second day was entirely different from the first. The theatrics had subsided, replaced by a tense, electric silence. Today was the defense's day to speak, and the air crackled with anticipation, fueled by the widespread coverage of the audio recording and the hint of the explosive evidence yet to come. Noah Mercer opened the defense's case with surgical precision. He didn't waste a moment on sentimentality, getting straight to the heart of the plaintiff's greatest vulnerability, their absence. He displayed a large, meticulously organized chart on the courtroom screen, a distillation of the green and red files, focusing only on the past 22 years. He had cross-referenced Walter's financial ledgers with Eleanor's daily engagement logs. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Noah began, his voice calm, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. The plaintiffs claimed they were loving, devoted children who were merely sidelined by the defendant's ambition. They claimed their numerous financial transactions with Justice Rhodes were simply gifts. Therefore, I have only one question to ask you to consider as we begin. In 22 years of adult relationship, how many times did Greg and Vanessa Cole visit Justice Walter Rhodes without an explicit corresponding request for money in the preceding, current, or subsequent month? He paused for a dramatic, calculated 3 seconds. The chart filled with data. At the bottom, a number appeared in bold, black type, 8. 8 times in 22 years, Noah stated, letting the number sink in. 8 acts of true, unsolicited, filial presence, the rest of the visits, the 256 financial transfers totaling $660,000 were, by our evidence, purely transactional. They came not for love, but for money. It was a staggering opening, instantly reframing the plaintiff's claim from one of undue influence to one of sustained neglect and financial exploitation. Next, I took the stand. I was not appearing as an assistant DOA. I was appearing as Ariel Shepard, the witness to Walter Rhodes's life. I spoke about the deep, unwavering love of my grandparents. I described my childhood in Briarport, the constant, gentle encouragement Walter gave my burgeoning interest in law, and the hours we spent debating constitutional law in his dark wood study. The red file came to life. Noah presented photographs, my high school graduation, my college commencement, my law school orientation. In every single photo, Eleanor and Walter were prominently featured, their faces radiating pride. Next to each photo, a blank space was marked with the names Greg and Vanessa Cole. The jury saw the physical, recurring manifestation of their abandonment. I presented a Christmas card from my parents bearing only a printed signature, contrasted against a handwritten, messy card from Walter that detailed a case brief he wanted me to read. My voice remained steady, clinical, but imbued with a deep, resonating truth that silenced any hint of doubt. The emotional core of the morning was delivered by Dr. Selena Ortiz, Drs. Ortiz, Walter's primary care physician, was direct and unimpeachable. She presented his cognitive evaluation files, proving he was fully lucid and mentally acute until the very end. Justice Rhodes was not easily influenced, Drs. Ortiz testified. In fact, he was preemptive. He insisted on the quarterly cognitive exams, stating he wanted a professional paper trail to prevent this very accusation of diminished capacity. Then she read from her private, personal notes. The judge had an unusual habit of debating complex legal issues with his granddaughter. I found a note in his file that I believe sums up his mental state and his relationship with the defendant. Ariel is the only person in my life who has never asked me for money. She only asks me for more time to debate case law. The air in the courtroom felt thick. The jury didn't just hear evidence, they heard Walter's own, unassailable testimony to my character. The testimony of Harvey Lane, Walter's estate attorney, confirmed the process. Lane was adamant. Walter revised his will 4 times, each time emphasizing his desire to leave the bulk of the estate to me. He confirmed that Walter had explicitly and voluntarily requested the videotaping of his final declaration. Justice Rhodes told me he wanted to be recorded, in his own environment, Lane explained, because he said his daughter and her husband would be challenging the memory of the court more than they would be challenging his own memory. He wanted the jury to hear it directly from him. The groundwork was laid, the paper trail was complete. It was time for the voice. Noah called Lydia Hart. She walked to the stand, professional and composed. Her history as Vanessa's employee immediately drew the aggressive attention of Damian Holt. Noah had her identify herself and her relationship with Vanessa. Then he played the audio from the gold file. The crackling, muffled background noise, Vanessa's unmistakable, sharp laugh, the damning phrase, "Just say, Dad only loves that little Ariel and it's done. The money flows right out." The sound echoed through the silent courtroom. Vanessa, at the plaintiff's table, looked like she might shatter her composure, her face pale with shock and fury. Greg was staring down at the table, his earlier confidence utterly gone. Holt launched immediately into cross-examination, desperate to discredit Lydia. "Isn't it true, Ms. Hart," Holt snarled, leaning into the microphone, "that you were privy to the Coles' financial difficulties, and you were consistently given a raise to ensure your loyalty?" "I was paid a salary, Mr. Holt," Lydia answered, meeting his gaze evenly. "And yes, I received a raise after Vanessa decided I was the only person she could trust with certain tasks." "So you were bought and paid for. You are a disgruntled, paid-off former assistant seeking revenge. Isn't that correct?" Lydia paused, her eyes shifting toward Vanessa, a look of profound pity and regret crossing her face. "No, Mr. Holt, that is incorrect," she stated, her alto voice cutting through the tension. "Vanessa Cole paid for my loyalty, but she did not pay for my truth. I chose to speak out not because of money, but because I saw the truth on 2 separate occasions. The first was seeing her laughing on that tape, bragging about emotionally exploiting her father. The second was witnessing her strike an adult stepdaughter, a 19-year-old, just for daring to sing a song she didn't approve of. She didn't flinch. The juxtaposition was devastating. The greed of the mother, the cruelty of the slap. Noah rose for redirect, not to ask about the violence for sympathy, but to bring it back to the pattern of behavior. "Ms. Hart," Noah said gently, "in your observation, did Mrs. Cole tolerate any voice, whether musical or conversational, that did not fit her own narrative of necessity and victimhood?" "No, sir," Lydia confirmed. "If you spoke a truth she didn't like, she attacked it, physically, emotionally, or financially." The point landed with crushing weight. The attack on my song, the attack on Walter's will, the attack on Lydia's character. It was all one unified pattern of suppressing any voice that challenged Vanessa's entitlement. Finally, the moment arrived. Noah announced the final piece of evidence. Your Honor, we will now present the video deposition of the deceased, Justice Walter Rhodes, recorded on his own volition on June 15th, last year, in his private chambers. The courtroom lights dimmed. A large screen descended. The video flickered to life, showing Walter seated behind his massive wooden desk, the iconic maple gavel resting prominently in front of him. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes clear and sharp, his voice firm and unmistakable. My name is Walter Rhodes. I am of sound mind and memory, he began, meticulously laying the foundation of his competency. He spent the next 5 minutes explaining the will, addressing the money, and then moving to the emotional core. I am leaving the bulk of my estate to my granddaughter, Ariel Shepard, for a reason that is both personal and legal. Walter stated, she chose to be present in my life and my wife's life when we were weakest, dealing with illness and age. My daughter, Vanessa, and her husband, Greg, chose to appear only when they were financially challenged or when they believed I was richest. I am a judge, and I must acknowledge the evidence of 22 years. My legacy belongs with the one who showed up. He then turned his gaze directly into the camera, addressing Greg and Vanessa. The father spoke now, not the judge. I forgive you, Walter said, his voice softening slightly, a quiet sorrow in his eyes. I forgive the neglect and the manipulation. I forgive the lies you told yourselves to justify the money you took. But the judge reappeared for the final word. However, he concluded, his voice ringing with judicial authority, the law does not operate on the level of guilt children feel, nor does it operate on biological ties alone. It operates on responsibility, on presence, and on the absence of undue influence. My daughter and son-in-law demonstrated undue influence over my finances for decades, using my paternal feelings as a weapon. They will not be allowed to use their greed to influence my final wishes. The camera continued to roll for a moment after he finished. Then, Walter Rhodes, the judge, the father, the grandfather, looked off to the side, toward the space where I always sat in his study, the shadow of his beloved granddaughter. A profound, gentle smile touched his lips. He lowered his voice, almost to a whisper, but the microphone picked up every syllable, clear and perfect. If you are listening, Ariel, he murmured, his last private message delivered in a public court. Use your voice. I never, ever wanted you to be silent for anyone. The video cut to black. The courtroom remained completely silent for a full minute. The voice of Walter Rhodes, the truth, was the final, devastating piece of evidence. The gavel, the ledgers, the documents. They were only instruments. His final word, his final charge to me, was simply my voice. I had listened. I had spoken. The trial, for all intents and purposes, was over. The final arguments concluded late on a cold, overcast Wednesday afternoon. Noah Mercer delivered a closing statement that didn't attack the plaintiffs, but simply laid out the evidence, piece by piece, relying entirely on the devastating juxtaposition of the green file, the transactional reality of the $2,500 monthly payments, and the gold file, the pure, untainted voices of Walter and Ariel. After the lawyers finished, Judge Blake did something unusual. She looked at me, Ariel Shepard, and offered an opportunity for a final, personal statement, not as a prosecutor, but as the individual at the heart of the dispute. I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. I walked to the edge of the defense table and looked directly at the jury. I didn't need notes. I know what you heard yesterday, I began, my voice clear and carrying perfectly in the silent courtroom. You heard the judge's will, you heard the doctor's notes, and you heard the financial records showing over $660,000 in financial transfers. I let the vastness of the numbers settle. But what I want you to remember is what they attacked, I continued, my gaze steady. The only time my birth mother ever physically touched me was when I was 19 years old. She struck me, hard, across the face. because I chose to sing a song in her house that she didn't approve of. This was not a moment of childhood discipline. It was violence against an adult woman for daring to express a truth that didn't fit her narrative. I turned toward the empty screen where Walter's video had played. My grandfather, Justice Rhodes, was a man who understood the power of the voice. He recorded his final declaration to ensure that no one, not his greedy children, not their lawyers, could distort his final will. Today, I am not asking you to protect me. I am asking you to protect him. Protect his choice, protect his will, and protect the right of every person to speak their truth without fear of violence, financial manipulation, or legal retribution. Damien Holt, sensing the momentum slipping away, made one final, desperate move. He interrupted, rising quickly. Your Honor, we must submit our final motion. The defendant's fixation on this one isolated incident, this clear obsession with abandonment, is evidence of a profound psychological instability. We insist that the court compel Miss Shepherd to undergo an immediate psychiatric evaluation. Judge Blake's expression was cold, utterly devoid of sympathy. She slammed her hand down on the desktop, not with the gavel, but with the flat of her palm. The sound cracked through the room. Mr. Holt, you are out of order, she declared, her voice ice. This court has reviewed the defendant's professional file, her 10 years of distinguished service to the district attorney's office, and the official statement of support from DA Janelle Cross. The motion is denied. The jury is here to weigh the evidence of undue influence on the deceased, not the emotional state of a surviving heir. That is the final word. The jury may now retire to deliberate. The jury filed out, their faces unreadable. The wait was agonizing. I sat alone at the defense table, Noah nearby, but the silence felt absolute. The years of neglect, the burden of Walter's secret, the shame of the slap, it all condensed into a few excruciating minutes. I could hear only the frantic scratching of the clerk's pen and the heavy, dull pounding of my own heart. When the jury returned, the collective gasp of the court announcing their return was the loudest sound. I held my breath. The foreperson, the woman who had taken notes meticulously during the cross-examination, stood to deliver the verdict. In the matter of Cole versus Shepherd, on the question of the validity of the last will and testament of Justice Walter Rhodes, we find in favor of the defendant, Ariel Shepherd. A rush of adrenaline hit me so hard I felt momentarily dizzy. The foreperson continued, reading the judgment. The court finds no evidence of undue influence by the defendant, dismisses all claims brought by the plaintiffs, Greg and Vanessa Cole, recognizes the will of Justice Walter Rhodes as valid and legally binding, and further, finds the plaintiffs liable for the entirety of the court fees and a substantial portion of the defendant's legal costs. A faint victorious smile touched Noah's lips. The financial exploitation was not only validated, but they were now financially punished for their greed. Judge Blake added a final, devastating coda to the decision. She looked over her glasses at the plaintiff's table, her voice stern. This court is not in the business of healing the emotional voids left by absent parents, she stated. The court's duty is to uphold the clear, articulated will of a responsible citizen who fulfilled his duty, as Justice Rhodes did. Case closed. It was over. But the final moment of high drama came from the plaintiff's table. As the journalists' cameras began to flash, Vanessa erupted. She leapt to her feet, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at me. You betrayed us. You are a traitor to your own blood. Ariel, she screamed, her carefully constructed mask of victimhood shattering completely. Instinctively, Greg recoiled. For the first time, he didn't rush to comfort her or join her attack. He took a physical step back, away from the raw, ugly explosion of entitlement he had enabled for decades. I turned to face Vanessa. The courtroom microphones were still active, capturing every syllable. I spoke calmly, quietly, but with absolute conviction, ensuring my voice was heard perfectly over her hysterical cries. I did not betray my family. Vanessa, I said, my eyes locked on hers. I simply accepted the truth, and the truth is, family is not defined by the people who demand your silence when you speak the truth. I turned and walked out of the Lakefield County Courthouse. I stripped off my heavy prosecutor's blazer, finally letting the sunlight touch my skin. My phone buzzed. It was Maya. She had already edited the video, a powerful cut that spliced together my performance at the crooked note, the young woman singing her pain, with the final, whispered charge from Walter in his video. Use your voice. The comments were flooding in, calling it the perfect symphony of justice and truth. I smiled, not because of the financial victory, but because of the victory of my own voice. From this day forward, no one, not my birth mother, not my estranged father, not the cold systems of law or money, could use violence, shame, or fear to silence me again. The voice that had been struck for singing had finally stood firm in the highest court, protected by the very law I had dedicated my life to. Thank you so much for listening to the story of the voice that couldn't be silenced. We love hearing from our community. Please comment below and let us know where in the world you're tuning in from, so we can connect and share our thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to Lila Revenge Stories. Hit that like button. And if you truly love the story, please hit the hype button to help this video reach more listeners who need to hear the sound of justice.